Good afternoon. I hope you all had a nice lunch. I know some of you are just joining us for the afternoon session, so welcome. My name is Fikar Getacho. I'm an assistant researcher at Amani, and it's my pleasure to moderate this important discussion on the 2025 Peacebuilding Architecture Review. This session comes at a crucial time as we mark 20 years since the establishment of the UN Peacebuilding Commission, which is at the core of the UN Peacebuilding Architecture, along with the Peacebuilding Support Office and the Peacebuilding Fund. 20 years down the line, there has been a dramatic deterioration in the ability of the multilateral system to prevent conflict and build peace. Major global shocks in recent years have challenged the credibility of international institutions, and conflicts remain persistent, financing remains uncertain, and the transition from peacekeeping to peacebuilding is still a challenge. In this respect, the Peacebuilding Architecture Review is an opportunity to address some of the persisting challenges and ensure that the peacebuilding efforts are effective, inclusive, and sustainable. The fourth review of the UN Peacebuilding Architecture, mandated by the General Assembly Resolution and Security Council Resolution 2558, includes an informal phase, which took place in 2024, and a formal phase, which will take place throughout 2025. The review is particularly significant in the context of the latest guiding multilateral frameworks, such as the recently revised AU PCRD policy, the new Agenda for Peace, and the Pact for the Future, all of which promote more effective global governance responses to conflict management. In his 2022 report to the Security Council on transitions in UN peace operations, the Secretary General noted the need to better coordinate mission transitions with national peacebuilding strategies. The second annual joint consultative meeting between the Peace and Security Council and the United Nations Peacebuilding Commission also underscored the need for a structured transition from peacekeeping to peacebuilding to sustain peace. During the morning sessions, we've been talking about trends in PSOs and peacekeeping and the future of peacekeeping. And as we move on to the Peacebuilding Architecture Review, in light of the untimely drawdowns and departure of the missions in the continent, like that of MINUSMA, MONUSCO, and SAMIM, and the recurring challenge of linking peacekeeping to peacebuilding, we would like to address what specific reforms are needed to create smoother transitions between these phases, and how can the UN peacebuilding architecture be further leveraged during mission transitions. Given also the evolving nature of conflict, including the climate change-induced instability and governance breakdowns, Commissioner Bankole has called for, and I quote, a new mindset on peacebuilding. Does Africa need a radical rethink of peacebuilding models? If so, what should that look like? So we all know that the integration of governance and peacebuilding frameworks is crucial for conflict prevention and management. How can the United Nations peacebuilding architecture work more effectively with African mechanisms like ABSA and AGA and other mechanisms such as APRM and AUDA-NEPAD? To discuss these and more, we have a lineup of excellent panels with deep expertise. We are joined by Ambassador Mohammed Idris, who is a former permanent representative of Egypt to the UN and one of the UN independent eminent persons for 2025 Peacebuilding Architecture Review, joining us online. Also online is Ambassador Walid Nalpo, Senior Political Advisor at Accord, who will be representing Dr. Vasu Gauden. Ambassador Nalpo is a diplomat and policy expert who has played a critical does not need any introduction to all of you. Ambassador Mohammed Idris, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much. You hear me well? The voice is clear? Okay. Thank you, dear Fikr. Thank you very much. And due recognition and appreciation to dear brother Dr. Solomon Derso and dear brother Qasim Wan and dear brother Ambassador Mohammed Gad, distinguished organizers, ambassadors, panelists, and participants. It is indeed a great pleasure and honor to participate in this important and timely policy conference. I'm also so delighted to view this venue, which I've been so many times to it in the Hilton Hotel in lovely Addis Ababa, a city very close to my heart with so many everlasting friendships and dear memories since being there as ambassador of Egypt to sister Ethiopia and the PR to the African Union. From a wide-angle lens, this event grasps a multitude of important dimensions. It's taking place at the backdrop of grave geopolitical global landscape with serious implications, especially on Africa. It tackles a crucial pillar of UN and AU activities, a pillar which entails the main footprints and the main qualifier for judging the efficiency of both the UN and the EU. As well, it's taking place on the heels of the Summit of the Future and its adopted Pact of the Future, concurrent with the ongoing process of the 2025 Peacebuilding Architecture Review, and prior to the Peacekeeping Ministerial Review, also the Financing for Development Summit and the Social Security Summit, with deep interlinkage between all these events. The valuable and innovative recent independent study on the future of peacekeeping conducted by my dear brother and friend El Ghasibwan and his colleagues, as well as the ongoing 2025 review of the UN peacebuilding architecture, are crucial endeavors for reshaping peacekeeping and repositioning peacebuilding to be up to the new challenges and more fit for purpose. The independent eminent persons, 5 persons, appointed by the UN Secretary General for the 2025 PBAR, which I have the honor to be a member of, conducted intensive engagements with key stakeholders within the UN system, with regional groups, especially the Active African Group in New York, as well as the civil society. Its conclusions were submitted to the Secretary General as an input to the informal phase of the 2025 PBAR and referred to the ongoing formal phase of negotiations among member states that will culminate in dual resolutions of the GA and Security Council, representing the official outcome of the 2025 PBAR process. What was the departing point of the independent eminent persons? It was the observation that valuable recommendations came out of previous reviews. However, few were implemented, and they should be operationalized. Also, the fact that there is an increasing demand for engagement with the Peace Building Commission and benefiting from the Peace Building Fund, most from sisterly countries in Africa. There are points of complexity and controversy transpired, which are of much relevance and impact to African countries and worth African consideration and contribution. I will dwell briefly on some. First, how to grasp the real applicable definition of national ownership, which all agrees on, but differs on its application. Is it the national governmental authorities, or is it rather more inclusive to include NGOs and civil society organizations? And as well, the importance of ensuring real national priorities, not donor-driven, either explicit or implicit agendas. Second, the concept of prevention. Concerns revolve on drawing the somewhat elusive border and not to cross the thin line between prevention and intervention, encroaching on national sovereignty. Third, the nexus between development, security, and human rights, as well as addressing climate change implications, while avoiding the risk of securitizing development. Fourth, the validity of proper relations with Security Council and peacekeeping. The need to bypass outdated sensitivities and elusive competitions and to have a more complementary, synergetic, value-added engagement, not a marginalized, undermined relationship. To share a perspective on the way forward, let me briefly mention a few points. One, the need for repositioning the United Nations peacebuilding architecture, conceptual, financial, and implementation-wise. Two, 6 bridges need to be crossed for strengthening the peacebuilding architecture and addressing the drivers of conflict. They are peace gap, inequality gap, gender gap, climate gap, digital gap, and generational gap. 3, the need to manage expectations while being ambitious and pragmatic. Fourth, conceptual repositioning. Through a conceptual wide angle beyond the only 2005 established peacebuilding architecture entities, namely the Peacebuilding Commission, the Peacebuilding Fund, the Peacebuilding Support Office, and streamlining peacebuilding mandates across the UN system, consequently enhancing synergy, addressing systemic incoherence, and widening financial base. Five, linked to this conceptual repositioning is a new culture and mindset. Moving from peacebuilding as a secondary afterthought post-conflict measures to a primary prevention and sustaining peace role in the UN peace and security pillar with a focused developmental and the political lens. Six, financial repositioning. Some elements are here. A, to move with the recent agreed assessed contributions forward and the need to achieve the quantum leap called for by Secretary General. He called for $500 million annually as a quantum leap. Of course, this has not been achieved yet. Actually, a quantum leap plus is needed. B, unpacking the financing for peacebuilding resolution. Resolution 76/305, which Africa was a driving force behind it and operationalizing its many agreed upon recommendations. C, revisiting partnerships with the IFIs, aiming at a more strategic aligning in policies, not only increased amount of funding. D, linking financing for peacebuilding to climate financing and financing for SDGs. An annual financing for peacebuilding forum could be launched or integrated into existing mechanisms. Seven, enhancing partnerships with regional partners, especially the African Union, and leveraging regional developmental plans, especially African Agenda 2063. Eight, implementation repositioning, and this entails a couple of points. A, meaningful national ownership based on the most needed priorities of each country in a context-based perspective. B, inclusivity through a whole society approach. C, more dependence on local actors for implementation. Then 9, the need for harnessing demographic dividend, especially in Africa, with the majority of population are women and youth, and the role is very crucial in the future of effective peacebuilding. Then the importance of desensitized, reinvigorated relationship with Security Council through equality, analytical, evidence-based advice to the Council, as well as a more integrated built-in relationship with peacekeeping in its evolving future models. Number 11, better branding and wider advocacy, showcasing success stories, lessons learned aimed to augment the power of narrative and the power of perception for peacebuilding. 12, adopting a more evidence-based parameters to assess impact and promote scalability and sustainability. 12, institutional enhancement through several steps. A, reinvigorated Peacebuilding Commission, flexible decision-making mechanism, empowered Peacebuilding Fund, and strengthening the Peacebuilding Support Office through more staff and the capabilities. Here, for the sake of time, and we can come again in any further discussion, I would like to conclude with an important reminder from the above-mentioned Future of Peacekeeping study. When it mentioned that looking to the future, fresh thinking is needed. This is indeed very valid. Also, the study noticed the increased mis- and disinformation and the capability expectations gap. This is very important. Capability expectations gap is very important to take care of. And the last point is what the study referred to about the strong links between peacekeeping and the UN's broader prevention and peace-building agendas, as well as the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. I have to stop here and to thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Idris. We will get back to you after the floor. Ambassador Walile Nalpo, over to you. I pass the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for allowing me to step in for Advocate Vasu Kondan, who, as it was explained in the letter, could not be able to make the presentation and therefore asked me to do so on behalf of our court. Let me thank the AU for the invitation and also for, of course, the organizers of this meeting. Let me again say that whatever I'm going to present, wherever there are repetitions, I'm going to avoid them so that for the sake of time, I must upfront endorse that, particularly the ambassador who had just spoken before me, and having listened very carefully to the first panel and subsequent panels, I'll just avoid that. So if you allow me, I'll proceed on that basis. The evolving landscape of global peace and security necessitates a critical examination of both peacekeeping and peacebuilding frameworks. The October 2024 study, titled The Future of Peacekeeping, New Models and Related Capabilities, and the forthcoming 2025 review of the peacebuilding architecture present pivotal opportunities to reassess and harmonize these approaches. For Africa, a continent deeply invested in both peacekeeping and peacebuilding, understanding the convergence of these reviews is essential to formulating a unified stance and strengthening collaboration between the African Union and the United Nations. A convergence of peacekeeping and peacebuilding reviews. First, integrated approaches. Both reviews emphasize the necessity of cohesive strategies that bridge the gap between immediate peacekeeping efforts and long-term peacebuilding initiatives. The October 2024 study advocates for modular and adaptable peacekeeping models that can seamlessly transition into peacebuilding phases, ensuring sustainability and coherence in operations. Local ownership and inclusivity. The 2025 Peacebuilding Architecture Review underscores the importance of national and regional ownership in peace processes. Similarly, the future peacekeeping models highlight the need for people-centered approaches, ensuring that operations are tailored to the unique context of host nations and involve local stakeholders in decision-making processes. Both reviews recognize the evolving nature of global threats, including technological advancements, transitional organized crime, climate crisis, and public health emergencies. Addressing these challenges requires a unified strategy that leverages both peacekeeping and peace-building tools to build resilient societies capable of withstanding such multifaceted threats. Shaping African perspectives and inputs. Africa's unique experiences with conflict and post-conflict recovery provide valuable insights into effective peace strategies. By actively participating in these reviews, African nations advocate for the models that reflect the continent's realities, ensuring that both peacekeeping and peace-building efforts are culturally sensitive and contextually appropriate. The convergence of these reviews offers an opportunity to bolster the AU peace and security architecture, aligning AU initiatives with UN frameworks can lead to more coordinated and effective responses, enhancing the continent's capacity to manage and resolve conflicts independently. Resource mobilization and capacity building. Engaging in the reviews allows African nations to highlight the need for sustained funding and capacity building efforts. This advocacy can result in increased support for local institutions, enabling them to implement peace initiatives effectively and reduce reliance on external interventions. Institutional collaboration. The alignment of peacekeeping and peacebuilding strategies necessitates close institutional ties between the AU and the UN. Regular consultations, joint planning can lead to harmonized policies and shared objectives, minimizing overlaps and maximizing impacts. Joint training and operations, developing joint training programs and collaborative operational frameworks can enhance interoperability between AU and UN forces. This synergy ensures that peace missions are conducted efficiently with a unified command structure and shared best practices. Policy coherence. By contributing to a common African position in peace building, architecture review, African nations can influence global policies to be more attuned to the continent's needs. This collective voice can advocate for policies that are both preventive and responsive, addressing root causes of conflict while managing crisis effectively. In conclusion, the simultaneous examination of peacekeeping and peace-building frameworks presents a unique opportunity for Africa to assert its perspectives and enhance its role in global peace efforts. By understanding and contributing to the convergence of these reviews, African nations can ensure that future strategies are inclusive, context-specific, and effective, strengthening policy engagement between the AU and UN is pivotal in this endeavor, paving the way for more peaceful and resilient continent. Thank you very much. I look forward to discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We will be coming over to you as well. Dr. Salomon, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Fikr. The Peacebuilding Architecture Review comes following the 2020 review, in respect of which the African Union actually developed a common position, which through consultation, which was presented both here in Addis but also in New York through the Africa group. And at the time we had the pleasure of contributing on the basis of the consultation that was held by Dr. Sarjo Pa, the director for conflict management at the PAPS department. At the time, he was leading the consultation and the development of the Common African Position. And the same exercise is currently underway. And some of the issues, I think, from the past will emerge. And among them, obviously, is the question of partnership. The African Union, particularly through the Peace and Security Council, over the years, have institutionalized the annual consultation between the Peace and Security Council and the Peacebuilding Commission. Last year, initially, for a number of years, it was an informal consultation. But since 2024 or 2023, in 2023, they made a decision to elevate the consultation into a formal consultation. One of the most important developments in that context has been the increasing recognition, at least at a normative level on the part of the Peace and Security Council, to the significance of the role of peace building in various conflict situations that the Peace and Security Council itself is seized with. And where I think the next stage would be to see concretely how the African Union post-conflict reconstruction development policy, which was actually updated, and it was the updated policy framework was endorsed last year in February by the heads of state and government of the African Union. I would hope that the Common African Position would actually anchor itself on this updated post-conflict reconstruction and development policy of the African Union, given that this was adopted only last year, February, by the heads of state and government. And there, one of the questions, practically speaking, is how peace-building interventions by the African Union through the PCRD policy and the Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Development Center based in Cairo would be the whole question of how do you decide on peace-building interventions? And what kind of consultations and engagement would you have between the African Union and the Peacebuilding Commission in deciding what kind of peacebuilding interventions and where those peacebuilding interventions would be carried out? And who would play what kind of role in respect to the implementation of those peacebuilding interventions, particularly on the African continent? Now, if you look at the journey of the Peacebuilding Commission over the past 2 decades, you would find that many of the cases of the Peacebuilding Commission have been here on the African continent, just like many of the peacekeeping operations have been here on the African continent. And that clearly underscores that Africa is where both the various issues that both ambassadors who spoke before me, and indeed Ambassador Idris, as a member of the eminent panel, highlighted, have emerged in the context of the situations that we have, that the Peacebuilding Commission have dealt with. And in these situations, I think there have been a number of issues that have come up. One of the issues have to do with, of course, the relationship between peacekeeping and peacebuilding. Earlier on in the morning, Tafsat in her intervention, Paul, as well as one, they mentioned the importance of the peace process, the importance of other dimensions of peace building for purpose of effectiveness of peacekeeping operations. And this, you clearly see it in terms of the time at which and the kind of peace building interventions that get introduced in the course of and as part of the planning of peacekeeping operations. There has already been in the UN Security Council recognition that the Peacebuilding Commission plays a very important role in advising the UN Security Council in terms of at the time of mandating and the planning and deployment as well as implementation of peacekeeping operations. I think that is also where you clearly see, with respect to transitions, for example, the important role of peace building and how peace building intervention or the scope of peace building needs to incrementally expand as peacekeeping in the context of peacekeeping transition. And whether or not we have found that balance is clearly one of the issues, for example, that we have experienced in the context of the departure of UNAMID from Darfur and its substitution or replacement by UNITAMs, as you may recall, which unfortunately have all gone down the drain as a result of the eruption of the war in Sudan. And that actually brings to the fore the question of the kind of conditions, particularly political conditions, that are a prerequisite for successful peace building intervention. And these questions of the prerequisites for successful peace building intervention and the role of the Peace Building Commission are really serious issues that need to be taken into account. And that brings me to the question, to the point that both peacekeeping and peace building are preeminently and first and foremost political. We can't take the politics out of these things and think that these are actually what you may consider to be technical exercises or technical engagements, where the politics surrounding both the implementation of peacekeeping and the politics surrounding the implementation of peace-building interventions is lacking, then you would have both peacekeeping, as we have seen in Mali, and peace-building running into trouble. So how do you create the kind of political environment and political buy-in, not just on the part of host governments, but also on the part of key social and political constituencies at the national level is a prerequisite. And indeed, one of the challenge, the preeminent challenge for both peacekeeping and peace building is whether it is at all possible for them to successfully accomplish their mandate in the absence of what you may consider to be political settlement. In the absence of political settlement, is it possible for either peacekeeping or peace building to actually successfully be implemented at the national level? Can they be more than, a band-aid in that kind of situation where, earlier on the representative of the EU mentioned governance and structural state-related issues. And that have to do with also, of course, the state-society relationship questions. And these are really very fundamental and what you may consider to be, first-order issues that require greater attention. The other aspect has to do with, of course, the relationship and the partnership dimension. And this has to do with the kind of, for example, in the current review, when the first review was undertaken, the 2020 review was undertaken, for example, the PCRD Center in Cairo was not there. Now the PCRD center in Cairo is there. And what kind of interface, normatively speaking, legally speaking, and institutionally speaking, will they have is a key question. And will you have in the peacebuilding arena the kind of situations that you have in the peacekeeping field, where you may have what you may consider to be multiple peacebuilding interventions, parallel peacebuilding interventions by the UN Peacebuilding Commission and by the African Union Commission on its own. You may recall that the UN Peacebuilding Commission deployed and undertook peacebuilding intervention in the Gambia, and a very productive one at that. And parallel to that, the African Union also deployed actually the first peacebuilding mission in the Gambia that actually engaged on issues relating to DDR, on issues relating to supporting security sector reform issues, and also transitional justice. These are the areas that the African Union mission engaged in. And what would be the division of labor and the kind of complementarity that one needs to envisage in the event of similar kind of parallel peace-building interventions by the UN and by that of the African Union. The other issue has to do with the question of demand-driven nature of intervention, which of course speaks to the earlier question or relates to the question of national ownership. And Ambassador Idris already mentioned there are contestations around the meaning of peace-building, national ownership in the context of the current review of the peace-building architecture. There are two schools of thought on this. One that puts emphasis on the question of sovereignty, another one that actually puts emphasis on the scale of participation and inclusivity of various sectors of society in the design and implementation of peace-building interventions. And we have to see how these actually two schools of thought would be finally reflected in the peace-building architecture review that is currently underway. But I would imagine that there should be, the two shouldn't be seen as mutually exclusive imperatives. The first one, that is the one that puts emphasis on sovereignty, needs to be seen from the perspective of whether there is willingness at the national level on the part of national authorities and national political actors to actually take active role and responsibility, both in the design, but also in providing support for the implementation of those peace-building interventions. Where national consent and active support is lacking, the likelihood is that you would have a supply-driven peace-building intervention whose success would be on the balance unless and otherwise it earns and gets the full support and cooperation of national authorities. So we can't wish away the question of sovereignty from that perspective. At the same time, demand can't be defined in terms only of sovereignty. It has to include the needs and interests of various sectors of society, including women, youth, and indeed those members of society affected by conflict situations. The issue of the relationship between the UN Security Council and the Peacebuilding Commission, as have been mentioned earlier on, is another aspect of the issue in respect of which there are contestations, again, particularly around the scope of the issues that would be covered in the Peacebuilding Commission's intervention. Would they include, for example, issues relating to human rights? Would they include issues relating to climate change? These are issues in respect of which there is no consensus in the UN Security Council. The good news is that, at least normatively speaking, and at least at the policy rhetoric level, there is in the Peace and Security Council protocol and in the Peace and Security Council's work, support for the inclusion of both the governance, human rights, and climate change related issues in post-conflict reconstruction and development interventions. And indeed, you will find this in the updated PCRD policy of the African Union adopted in 2021. The other element or issue has to do with the question of multidimensionality. And here, the experience that you would find, particularly in the context of the implementation of, for example, the MNJTF in Lake Chad Basin, and particularly the strategy for the stabilization of the Lake Chad Basin. I think the lessons from that are instructive in this respect. That the focus on security dimension of things, such as building rule of law, building national security institutions, building law enforcement capacities. These are important without a doubt. But if they are not actually complemented by interventions around socioeconomic and livelihood rehabilitation and support for spaces where the presence of government particularly is weak, then success is not going to come from the focus on those rule of law, law enforcement, and security institutions building or intervention dimension of things. That is why, for example, the lesson from, for example, the Gambia at a political level on investing in transitional justice becomes critical, not beyond and above those other elements. And in the Lake Chad Basin, of course, investment in rehabilitation of livelihood support activities, socioeconomic activities, and importantly, as we have, for example, outlined in our special report on how at the policy level we have been, our analysis and diagnosis of terrorism in Africa has been flawed, and as a result, we had a flawed approach to the response. We have clearly identified that the issue of rolling out and supporting the establishment of legitimate local government structures that are focused on delivering services is crucial. That is what the example in Lake Chad Basin shows. And if there is going to be success in Somalia, it is going to be contingent on success in rolling out and building these local legitimate structures of governance that are focused on delivering services. Finally, the question of funding. It is a cross-cutting issue both for peacekeeping and for peace building. The US is a major contributor, as we heard in the morning, for peacekeeping. It is the same in terms of assets contributions, which has become a new source of funding for the Peacebuilding Commission as well since 2023. The adoption of the resolution granting the Peacebuilding Commission at least 50 million from assets contributions. The Peacebuilding Commission was previously dependent on voluntary contributions. So now with what we heard in the morning in terms of what is happening and the almost inevitability of the US pulling the plug on its funding to the UN, what is going to happen to that resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2023? And how are we going to actually fill in the gap? Are there possibilities for filling the gap? That is really another issue that we need to bear in mind. Let me stop here and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salomon. The interventions have been very clear and direct, so I will not summarize them. I'll pass the floor direct to the floor. I'll open to the floor to for questions and comments, as well as people joining us online. Feel free to drop your questions or comments in the chat box, and they will be reflected. Questions from the room? Yes. Sure.
I have a small one this time. By all that, what was raised during the statements that were given, by all these demands to this process, how do we see right now these current task force, AU-UN process, which hasn't started? So what will it answer then? Can someone in the room at least give us a little bit update on that? What will be covered by these Task Force 2719 for AU-UN? Then my fear is if everything is included, what was stated here, even the Armani Handbook on African Union will be one-pager.
Anybody else? There's a question online. I don't know who it's addressed to, but as AU is now prioritizing the operationalization of the African Humanitarian Agency, is there any discussion on how to bring in some of the considerations being discussed today in African Humanitarian Agency? Okay. Yes, please.
And Dr. Solomon, you brought up a good point with respect to bringing the grassroots, the laymen, and the population of Africa into this conversation with respect to programs and projects for the grassroots and for the layman and for the general citizen in Africa. Can you tell us, are there any examples of those type of programs that have been implemented so far?
Okay, let's move with these back to the panelists, and then we'll go back for the second round. Ambassador Dries, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Fikar, and thank you for all the panelists and the questions which were raised. Actually, maybe some about the task force, about the AU-UN and the African Humanitarian Agency. I'm sure colleagues in Addis will have maybe more updated information about it. But maybe let me stress some points about the political nature of the peacekeeping and peace building. It's true, fully agree that this is not technical, it's political at the end. And that's why political lens is so crucial. Without having a political lens, without having a political strategy and a political end goal for this, then will be perpetuating and having a long-lasting presence and long-lasting endeavors, but without a fruitful result at the end. So this is very important. And the other also is that the importance of defining the scope, because sometimes we are faced with formidable tasks which are not possible to deliver. For example, when you talk about peacekeeping, are we talking about peacekeeping or peace enforcement? Of course, peacekeeping also went to several phases. And at some points, we are stuck with peace enforcement, not peacekeeping. And this, of course, needs different normative and operational structure. The same with peace building. Also, sometimes in peace building, we are faced with the task of state building. And this, of course, also goes beyond the capability of the peace building architecture and structure with the current ways and means. So it's important to have this, to manage this relationship, which also the study referred to about the expectations and the capability gap. The point also that apparently, as has been highlighted, the vehicle of peace building or of peacekeeping is now having more passengers on it. And for this vehicle to reach its destination, it needs also a different structure and fuel. It cannot, for example, the Peacebuilding Commission, when it started, was focusing on 6 country configurations, specific country configurations. Now it is catering for more than 30 countries. Of course, it is also in different parts of the world, but as has been mentioned, most of the passengers on this vehicle are from sister African countries. So, and for this vehicle to be able to cater for this increasing passengers, there is a need for more will and skill. Will, political will is so important in this, and skill in the means of financing and proper institutional structure to face these surmounting challenges. Maybe the last point is the cost of missed opportunity is so high. So I think it's important that we move into action, into implementation. There have been lots of ideas, variable ideas floated in the past and in the present. And the very important is to take it into implementation, and because the cost of missed opportunity within this grave geopolitical situation is very costly, especially for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me pass to Dr. Salamon, and I'll pass back to Ambassador Nalpo.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me start by maybe creating a new problem in the optimism that is seemingly emerging. But the concrete realities of what is happening in New York and the impact this is going to have even on the implementation of the findings of this report. I recall when the Peacebuilding Commission was meted out and then it had to be implemented and funded. I was working at the TPA at the time, and at the time, the 3 countries that were earmarked for the pilot project. So we had to go and make a presentation to the 5th committee. And that's when we were told that, yes, the process will have to continue to function, and an office will be opened in the Secretary General's office, but funded from existing budgets. Now, funded from existing budget, it means no money is going to be added, because the notion of what is now a current, which I'm going to comment on, of assessed contributions was a no-go area. We left that place terribly frustrated. We knew this was not going to take off. UNDP had to step in, and that's how the beginning of the implementation of the Peacebuilding Commission. And the countries that were willing to contribute did so. But these were also the very contributors to the programs of the UNDP on the ground. Now, looking at the current dynamics, the shift from development in terms of emphasis by the major countries that were contributing towards development, the shift from that to trade. And we're told in no uncertain terms in one webinar when we're engaging, one of the people who's working in the Peacebuilding office, that, well, the implications of the Pact of the Future, the decision on peace building, is that you are going to fund your own development and peace building operations. It's up to you. as Africans, it's a wake-up call. The appetite is no more there. We all wished it was not true. And I still hope it cannot be true. The Secretary General is still trying to fight that battle and needs all our support. The notion of peace through force that is now being operationalized outside of the UN, I think is something that we have to look at, because if interests of big powers are going to be the ones that determine how particular conflicts are resolved outside of all of these things that we are talking about, it's just going to make things even worse. So we'll have to really begin to think very fast in terms of how best we are going to survive the storm that is coming. Earlier, there was a reference to decisions in Washington in terms of USIP and its implications, which is indicative of a particular attitude. There are even suggestions that they might even close their embassy. They actually want to put it up for sale, the embassy in New York. And the possibility is that is true. And if that happens, what does that signal in terms of the future participation of the US within the United States? These are signals. If certain things that are happening at the domestic level, multilaterally, and particularly the UN having been a target all along, I think we have to rethink the beautiful ideas that we have in terms of how do we survive under the new conditions if things go in the way of those who are wanting to undermine multilateralism, and particularly the United Nations, on very critical issues like development and matters of peace and security, and in particular, peace building. But I think also one of the things that we have to look at very clearly is from the time of the mediation processes and negotiations. By the time we have a peace agreement, I think we should be able to start making that link as to how do you then move to peacekeeping if it becomes necessary in terms of the agreement and the response of the UN or AU, and peace building going forward. Because the tension that used to happen at the United Nations between DPKO and DPA had an impact on the transition, because peacekeeping missions would fold up, and then you initiate a peace building mission which is still under control of the DPKO, and that tension created a lot of problems. So the power dynamics within the United Nations might have an impact on what we're doing getting forward. The current geopolitical tension might even make things worse. I am just saying that the context and the framework in which we're going to be faced with an environment where we're going to be implementing all these good ideas must also factor in the possibility of the disruption that we might have to face and the storms that we might have to be confronted with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Helpo. You hit the nail on the head. Perhaps one of the questions for the Peacebuilding Architecture Review would be whether there is a need for a very serious and hard look at this context and what this context means for peace building and the Peace Building Commission. That we can't operate on the basis of the assumption or the assumptions that existed at the time of, the decision for undertaking this review. We live in a qualitatively different moment from the time when the mandate was initiated by the UN for the peacebuilding architecture review. So the extent to which and how far the peacebuilding architecture review actually have a very serious look at this qualitatively different context that we live in matters a great deal, and the kind of actually I don't know, solutions or the kind of propositions that it would put forward in terms of how we are going to imagine and think about, plan and deploy peace building interventions in this qualitatively different context, I think is going to matter a great deal, at least in the short to the medium term. And as Ambassador Nehelpo rightly pointed out, all of our ideas are beautiful, but if they are removed from the broader and very serious geopolitical context that we find ourselves in, we may end up having a peacebuilding architecture review that's not adequately grounded and that doesn't actually provide the requisite response to the weight of this particular context and moment. Of course, we can debate on whether or not this moment is a passing moment or it's going to stay here with us for the foreseeable future. And that, of course, is a very important consideration. The role and work of the joint AU and UN task force, particularly with respect to 2719, of course, the essence of that task force is on working towards the implementation of 2719. Again, it is premised on the assumption that if the technical dimension of 2719 are properly carried out, the planning dimension of it, the budget-related dimension of the process are properly done, then there is a possibility for presenting a proposal to the UN Security Council for its endorsement as a follow-up to 2760 67, right? But again, the time 2767 was adopted, that is December, and now completely different. Even on that one, the US actually abstained, as you recall, for that one as well. Now it's even a no-go area. So the question in that respect is, the task force is still working. Actually, the day before yesterday, at the level of the African Union Commission, the task force at the level of the AU Commission had a meeting in preparation for the joint proposal that would be submitted, and this would be finalized in May in anticipation of the UN Security Council meeting in June. So the work of the different work streams of the joint task force is still underway. I think they can't stop, what they need to do on their part. They don't have control over the politics. And that is something for member states, and if at all, the Secretary General is going to have a role in that respect. So that is basically currently underway. I think with respect to the examples in terms of interventions at the local level, I think it's important to bear in mind that the idea of what they call quick impact projects is an idea that has been around. Whether or not it is successful and impactful, as you can see, the naming itself is telling. Quick impact projects is basically trying to have and maintain good working relationship with local communities by addressing local issues, basically, and trying to resolve, local needs or to address local needs. Earlier on, Ambassador Charles of Rwanda mentioned one of the success factors for Rwanda's contribution in peacekeeping, for example, which is the community relationship and supporting socioeconomic activities at the local level. So there are indeed those examples. But in terms of their scope and changing the bigger dynamics of peace and security, I think they can contribute to, but by themselves obviously wouldn't be enough. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
We have a panelist, a participant online that wants to ask a question. Biryam Berhe from the Embassy of Eritrea. The floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. And I would like to thank all the panelists for their contributions. Since both Ambassador Muhammad Idris, Ambassador Walid Wantlapo, and Dr. Solomon have given us a background on the UN policy on peace building, I don't have much to say on that. But as Dr. Solomon has tried to bring the issue back to within the context of the APSA, African Peace and Security Architecture, I think there is a fundamental gap in regard to peace building. We have the policy, we have the center, but if you look at prioritization, the priority that's given to peace building is minimal, and it also reflects in the budget and financing. So if we look conflict as, if we use a medical metaphor, which Ambassador Muhammad Idris, as a physician, would also appreciate, is that we reach peace building after early warning Pacific resolution has failed. And we go to peacekeeping, which is really costly, and we have peace building. But the priority and the finance given to these preventable ways are minimal, both in the African Union context and in the UN. So the other issue, we talk about African problems for African solutions for African problems, but do we have the institutional capacity to do so? Do we have the finances to do so? And in regard to when we talk about African solutions, at which level are we talking about? Is that at the level of member states, REX, AU, UN partners? So to just summarize what I would like to say, that this is an important issue which should be highlighted, and we have to build on the policies that we have and the center that we have in Cairo in order to prioritize, increase financing, and assert ownership, African ownership, and also identify roles to each levels at member state level and AU, UN, so that we can implement the policy orientations contained in the PCRD, which is consolidate peace, prevent relapse of violence, address root causes, and ensure reconstruction. So mine is more of a comment than a question. I thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the House? Yes, please.
Thank you once again. I just want to have more reflections on the interplay between peace building and peacekeeping. Dr. Solomon, you touched it on this, but don't you think that there needs to be defining those structures? The UN have two structures, peace building and the peace operations. Again, even within the African Union, we can see two structures. But in real terms, what is actually the peacekeeping or peace support operation doing is peace building. They take sector reform, election support, local engagement. All those activities, the mandate of peace support operations are really a peace building activities. So where are we defining the peacekeeping and the distinguishing from the peace building architectures, then how the structures can come up together so that to address, the same jobs like the two structures are doing. So maybe if you can reflect on that one. Thank you.
Thank you. If we do not have any more questions, I'll raise some questions to the panelists, and then we can go on to concluding remarks from this panel. And then I guess the room is tired. Maybe you'll have coffee. So Ambassador Idris, in your initial intervention, you raised the point of implementation of recommendations. Many of the recommendations from the 2020 review, which resulted in 792 recommendations and 261 sub-recommendations, have not yet been implemented. So what lessons can be applied to ensure that this review results in meaningful and implementable recommendations rather than what we might consider long lists of aspirations? Ambassador Napo, Accord has been collaborating with the United Nations Peacebuilding Support Office and South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation to host African Regional Thematic Consultation on the 2025 review of UNPA. If you could share what came out of these consultations, we'd be really grateful. Building on to the question raised by Marasa, Dr. Salomon, during the 2020 review, one of the issues that was being raised was that the AU and the UN often use different terminologies for peace building. The AU uses PCRD, sustaining peace, stabilization, interchangeably in African frameworks. And in your view, does this show lack of conceptual clarity? And if so, does it have an effect? Does it have an impact on the effectiveness? And if so, what steps can be taken to build a more coherent and unified approach between the AU and the UN when we talk about peace building? With this, I think there are no more questions in the room, so I will pass over to the panelists to reflect on the questions raised and do your concluding remarks. For a change, let me start with Dr. Salomon.
Me on the spot. Thank you very much, my brother Biniam from the state of Eritrea, PR to the African Union. I think the questions about prioritization in the policy thinking of the AU and that of the UN. I don't know how that shift can be achieved in practical terms, but indeed, as one mentioned in the morning as well, there is much of the focus of the operation and the work of the AU has been on the reaction part of it, on the peacekeeping dimension of it, on conflict resolution or conflict management dimension of it. And it goes back to this point that made early in the morning. And the question about financing, of course, I think there, again, it relates to prioritization, because if you look at the budget, that often goes to peace building activities compared to the budget that goes to peacekeeping, or that, for example, is allocated to counterterrorism. You clearly see enormous difference. Peacebuilding doesn't really get the level of priority or attention, financially speaking, as development interventions and development support activities. And therefore, I can't agree more with you that there is a need now for transitioning from policy, from putting in place structures, to actually the designing and implementation of peace building activities and interventions. And this, of course, comes to and is linked to the question that Marasa raised about the relationship between peacekeeping operations and peace building. I think the idea that they are completely separate, of course, is not conceptually or factually accurate. Indeed, there is convergence, a lot of convergence between the mandate and the activities that peacekeeping operations undertake and that peace, I think it is the scale of and the level of, weight that these areas receive during peacekeeping and in the context of peace building that makes that you find where the difference is. There is, they get increasing attention as expand the peace building dimension of the work, particularly as you plan for and imagine exit of peacekeeping operations. That doesn't mean that it doesn't start. Actually, as I mentioned earlier on, there is already recognition, including in the UN Security Council, that the peacekeeping and peace building need to actually, from the very beginning, need to be planned and designed and imagined in a programmatic way, in a comprehensive and inclusive way, in such a way that you implement them programmatically as you face different elements of the mandate of peacekeeping, and then increasingly, of course, shifting towards the peace building dimension of implementation. I think that is, in terms of the relationship, the conceptual differences between between the use of the word peace building and that of post-conflict reconstruction and development on the part of the African Union. I wonder, normatively speaking, if the kind of activities, that is, from the perspective of the activities that are imagined in peace building, that are imagined in PCRD from activities perspective, are qualitatively different. I have yet really to find that qualitative difference from the perspective of what the kind of activities that are implemented because we call it peace building, and the kind of activities that are implemented because we call it post-conflict reconstruction and development. From activities perspective, I don't think that there is a qualitative difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Solomon. Ambassador Campo, we pass the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for asking about the outcomes. The outcomes, even on paper, even in terms of the discussions, will be very good. But the context in which you have to apply those decisions or those recommendations becomes another different issue altogether, because the environment that is constantly changing might not allow certain things to happen. That becomes a problem. And I think even those outcomes will have to go back and do a review, because some elements of them will be ruled out by the current realities. And that's number one. But I think I will take note of that, and then we'll have to share that. But I wanted to just get to one point again, because you see, peace building, I think one of the things that we should now begin to seriously focus on is state building and economic reconstruction. State building, because we're talking about institutions of state that will make a difference and eliminate some of the causes of the conflict that could have been identified during the time of the mediation. And the structural ones, that is the economic issues and others that will have to be able to attend to and assist that country to be able to do so. But for that to succeed, the temptation to push countries or people who are in contention or those who have been fighting to immediately go for elections. That is the basis for state building. You then assign or leave the responsibility of ensuring that peace can be built and a resilient state can emerge that will deal with those causes of conflict and be able to contain whatever residual problems that will be there, because there'll always be there. Fallouts from those that have been fighting because they did not get all of them what they wanted. DDR puts some people outside. There's a fallout. There are all of those things that we have to look at. But I think focus on the political parties, because they are the ones who constitute the executive, who constitute the legislature, who are the ones who've got to make a difference. And if you have political parties in name and no values and no any other idea, parties that are formed for the wrong reasons, then we've got a problem. And I think we have to take a lesson also from the recommendations and outcomes of the APRM, because they'll also help us to understand some of the weaknesses and challenges of governance, which is what leads to disputes that some people might decide to resolve through armed violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Idris, for your concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, dear Fikr, and building on the valuable presentations of my distinguished co-panelists and recognizing the importance of the questions posed, let me mention a few things. About the relation between peacekeeping and the peace building, of course, this relation evolved over time. At some point, it was assumed that you start peace building after you are done with peacekeeping. And of course, this proved to be futile, because sometime doing this, you will never end peacekeeping and you will never start peace building. So the relation became not sequential relation, but more organic and more interactive, that peace building should be built in peacekeeping from the beginning. So we witnessed that gradually the peace building mandates became built in the peacekeeping operations early enough in the peacekeeping missions. But this conceptual evolvement maybe is not much translated into a financial aspect. Still, of course, the discrepancy is so wide between the peacekeeping and the peace building. Because peacekeeping budget is close to $7 billion US dollars annually. It's almost double the regular budget of the UN, which is close to 3.5 billion annually. And the Peace Building Fund, which finances the whole work of the Peace Building, Building Fund, Financial Peace Building Commission, is still struggling to reach the SG's quantum leap goal for 500 billion. So the gap is so much between both. And this takes us to the point which was also alluded to, that these decisions are discussed and decided on politically. But when you implement it, it goes into a technical trap. And it was referred to the fifth committee. For example, when you go to the fifth committee for the implementation to get the money, you are dealing with a different dynamics, which is more process-driven than result-oriented. Meaning that in this process-driven, each one questions how much I'm going to pay, how much I'm going to get, how much I'm going to forfeit. And then who is providing troops, who's providing computers, who's providing helicopters, who's providing water for and livelihood ways and means. Everyone is looking what he is going to get, what he is going to lose. So you end up having some sort of technical process to implement the political decisions which were implemented, which were taken. And in this, of course, there is a very critical formula, which is blood and money, because some countries provide the money, some countries provide the troops, and the troops, you are buying blood. Then you get into this critical question about money versus blood. And this is a very tricky situation. And of course, it needs lots of discussion. But also about doing our homework in Africa is important, because we have also to define our priorities and be on the not on the supply side, but on the demand side. We have to cater for our people, for our societies, what are real priorities, what is beneficial to us, to not be driven by what others are ready to offer or what donors are willing to offer, but what really we are needing and what are our priorities. The other point is the transition settings is very important, of course. And now there is this discussion about whether the EU Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Fund should work even where there's no peacekeeping mission. Sometimes, of course, when the peacekeepings are withdrawing, there is a need to fill the gap and to avoid the cliff, which happens. So the peacebuilding activities are important here. But also, when there is no peacekeeping missions at all, there is also peacebuilding activities are needed, and peacebuilding endeavors should be ongoing. The last point is maybe that it's true that the picture is it's not easy. Complexities are too much. But we have also to say that changes are possible and changes are doable. It takes time, it happens slowly, but it is there. For example, the resolution for having assessed contribution for the Peacebuilding Fund, it took a long time, but it happens at the end. Countries who are adamantly opposing, at the end, they reach a compromise with those who were so much pro. And also it happens with the resolution for 2017-19 for financing having access of African-led peacekeeping operations from the assessed budget of the UN. Also, it took a long time. There are some reservations. Implementation is not moving as it should be, but there is some sort of shift. It happens. Also, the adoption of the financing for peacebuilding resolution, the 76/305. It has so much wide menu of options, which was unanimously agreed upon by member states, and it is up to be implemented. So I mean that change is possible, but it takes time. It needs diligence, it needs perseverance, and it needs hard work on all parties, whether on the international level or on the regional level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Idris, for that glimmer of hope, a good way to end. Thank you very much for our panelists, both online and in person. We have pushed our time a lot, so let's quickly break for coffee and be back for the last panel of the day. Thank you.